When I was just a kid, probably 10 or 11, I was starting to explore the internet and see the virtual world for myself. There were two things that I loved doing online: visiting forums and talking to interesting strangers, and exploring old video game ROMs. My dad would regale me with stories of playing the original Quake, StarCraft, or the Warcraft games with his friends, and before that, his childhood games on the Atari 2600. I was fascinated and spellbound by these mysterious titles. Even as a kid, I understood that there was a difference between old games and things like old books and movies. We still had a VHS player and movies from the 80s and 90s, but there was no way for me to experience my dad's childhood games. I always wanted to play them, but I had no way of doing so. I certainly didn't have the money to buy a retro Atari. Even so, when we happened to go to game stores, if I ever did come across old Atari cartridges, I would buy them anyway, my simple kid brain just happy to say that I owned them. Things changed when I discovered an old ROM website that not only had an insanely vast catalog of mostly Nintendo games, but also a robust list of emulators needed to run them. I was enchanted and started downloading old games left and right to try them out. Yoshi's Island, The Legend of Zelda: The Link to the Past, and the original Sonic game are some I remember being fascinated with. I have really good memories of being on a road trip with some friends, and all three of us crowding our hands around one laptop keyboard to play Mario Kart 64 together. When I shared my revelation with my parents, however, I was surprised when they expressed disappointment. What you're doing is piracy, I was told. Those websites are illegal and you're stealing from companies like Nintendo. I remember thinking at first that I didn't agree. I think on some level I understood that Nintendo and other publishers weren't selling these games anymore. But at the end of the day, I was just still an impressionable kid. And with the influence from my parents, I did something that I still really regret. I literally drafted an email to Nintendo telling them that this website I used was illegally distributing their ROMs. I actually got a response promising that they would look into it, and about a month later, that website's Nintendo ROMs were taken down. That website is still kicking almost 15 years later, and it still has never hosted Nintendo ROMs since. Yeah, sure, I was a kid and I was influenced by adults to do what I did, but I did and still do feel awful for letting those titles get taken down. I'm probably giving myself a little too much credit here. I mean, we all know that especially as of late, Nintendo is incredibly litigious, and it's possible that they would have taken action against that site anyway. But either way, I feel like I almost have a duty to support the field of game preservation. Maybe as a way to atone myself. But here's the thing. My parents were technically right. ROMs and distributing old games in general is technically illegal. But what happens when game publishers turn a blind eye? Alright, so what is abandonware exactly? It's not a real term, at least legally, but it's usually used to refer to software that, while still having an owner, is not available for purchase. It differs from the legal term of an orphaned work, which is when a copyright owner cannot be found or contacted. Take Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the 2001 video game, for example. You know, the one with PS1 Hagrid? Harry Potter is still very much an IP that is in use today, and EA Games, the developer, is certainly still around. Warner Brothers is even still making Harry Potter games, but good luck finding a place to buy this old title anywhere, unless you're buying a secondhand copy 20 years after its release. EA couldn't care less about this title. They certainly haven't made money off of it in years, and there's little to no risk of them losing current-day customers to people who want to play a 23-year-old Harry Potter game. There are thousands upon thousands of games that exist in a sort of weird limbo like this. Many of them are movie tie-in games or random DOS games, but a lot were once big-name titles. Prince of Persia, the original Civilization, and SimCity, several of the Need for Speed games. All of these titles can be downloaded at no cost and with no torrenting required. Sites like myabandonware.com, abandonwaregames.net, and oldgamesdownload.com faithfully host and freely offer thousands of games. And I encourage you to take a look at their archive. There are a lot of fun gems that you might find. It might seem surprising to hear that companies simply let sites like this be. By all accounts, distribution like this appears to be awfully close to piracy. But there's little need for hiding these services or relying on torrents for distribution because companies just don't care. These archives are extremely careful to only offer games that cannot be legitimately bought today, and often have personal boundaries set to only focus on games that are around 15 years or older. A lot of these games publishers simply don't see any value in pursuing legal action against sites that host games within these perimeters. Some do, of course. You'd be hard-pressed to find any Nintendo games on these sites because, well, yeah. A lot of these games' original developer studios also simply don't exist anymore. Some of the rights to their IP may have been sold or transferred to other people or companies, but a lot of the time those IP owners don't have any interest in doing anything with them. And so these games are allowed to exist online for people like you and I to download. When the rare instance arises where a publisher does have an issue with a game being hosted, these archive websites are usually more than happy to comply and remove the title. Sites like Abandonware will change their download links to a buy link if it's discovered that a title is still sold by the publisher somewhere. Reasons like these are why the term piracy isn't usually applied to abandonware by the public. I think most people recognize a difference between torrenting a game like, say, 2019's Need for Speed Heat and downloading 1998's Need for Speed 3. In a 2002 interview with GameSpot, Tim Schafer, a game designer behind titles like Day of the Tentacle, Grim Fandango, and Psychonauts, had this to say about abandonware. Quote, "Is it piracy? Yeah, sure, but so what? Most of the game makers aren't living off the revenue from these old games anymore. Most of the creative teams behind all those games have long since left the companies that published them, so there's no way the people who deserve to are still making royalties off of them. So go ahead, steal this game, spread the love," end quote. And while a lot of people might be hesitant to outright label using abandonware as piracy, he is correct. It is piracy, it is theft. At least in the eyes of the law. It's common knowledge today, and I speak as someone living in the United States, that our copyright laws are, and I believe the legal term here is bullshit. Companies like Disney are the reason why copyrighted works remain under the law for close to a century. Before they started lobbying for increased extensions, copyright protections lasted for a mere 28 years, with the possibility of a further 28 if the original owner had reason to file for an extension, as written in the Copyright Act of 1909. Nowadays, copyright protections for works from corporations stick around for up to 95 years. Oh, you're a fan of the hit 2011 release 20 Days to Find Amy? Well, sucks to suck. If you want to follow the law, you gotta at least wait until the year 2106 before you can legally download and share it for free. Understandably, a lot of people take issue with these laws. This extends outside of the realm of gaming too, of course. Less than a year ago, the Internet Archive was involved in a lawsuit with several book publishing companies that alleged it was unlawful for the archive to publicly provide access to books, unless it was explicitly a work that was free of copyright. The court finally sided with the companies, ruling that it was indeed unlawful for the Internet Archive to host public copies of literary works. In a public statement, the archive's founder said that, quote, "Libraries are more than the customer service departments for corporate database products. For democracy to thrive at a global scale, libraries must be able to sustain their historic role in society, owning, preserving, and lending books," end quote. Now, I don't think most people will make the argument that the right to share abandonware is a matter of preserving democracy, but it's certainly a matter of democracy of information. People from all over the world have a deep interest in preserving our human history, whether that takes the form of letters, photography, or movies. Even video games, which are still considered to be trivial by many, are a part of our human history, and it's vital to preserve that history. I think a great example of this is from a writer by the name of Darius Kazemi, who once gave a lecture at a conference called Critical Proximity in 2014, discussing the importance of video game source code. While Kazemi was analyzing the source code of a game called Jagged Alliance 2, he found a small essay written by one of the devs that discussed the philosophy behind that game's AI, a fascinating look into the mindset behind what they were creating. Or take the game Wolfenstein: Spear of Destiny. There was a piece of code that Kazemi found that looked at the current day's date to see if the game was being played after the beta test had concluded. Through this, he was able to find the exact date when the beta testing ended, September 30th, 1992. These two examples might seem incredibly pedantic, but personally I think they're a fantastic showcase of why being able to access old games in this way can be so valuable for historical preservation. Even the little details, the random DOS games, the forgotten movie tie-in games, they all have the potential to give us valuable insight within the history of game development. Each old ROM you find online is a showcase of the philosophy of its developers and a snapshot of the gaming industry from its time. They can serve as inspiration and a lesson to modern game devs looking to create their own works. Arguably, though, the majority of people care more about simply being able to enjoy these old games. And honestly, I think that's a legitimate enough reason to want to preserve them. If we all followed our copyright laws exactly, you would not be able to play many of your childhood games without a working console or a computer with an old OS. Not to mention an old copy of that game you're trying to play as well. Apparently, Nintendo Switch game cartridges have an estimated lifespan of just 20 years. This is probably a conservative estimate, but a compelling reason to want to digitize and preserve them nonetheless. No one wishes to be at the whim of a corporation to determine if they can access the games they grew up with. But technically, we all are. Games and computer programs in general are so new that no software written since 1964 is old enough for copyright to have expired in the US. It's all illegal to share unless it's been explicitly released or is an orphaned work. Thankfully, it's extremely rare for publishers to take action against abandonware websites, but it does still happen. The original official Abandonware web ring, created in 1997, was ordered to be taken down by the IDSA later that year. They did, however, seem to realize that it wasn't worth the battle, as it simply caused more archives to spring up in their place, but it goes to show that we shouldn't take abandonware libraries for granted. I think many people would agree that every year, the internet becomes less open, for lack of a better word. Corporations exert more and more influence on our laws that dictate what can be freely shared. I get especially concerned about things like video game preservation in the future, as it looks like many companies are eager to establish frameworks of eternal lending. They don't want you to own their products, they want you to pay for them for as long as you use them. When discussing solutions for these issues, a lot of people will talk about how copyright needs to change, how terms like orphan works and abandonware need legal definitions that allow the public to freely distribute them after a few decades or so. I think these are admirable positions to hold, but I also genuinely have little to no faith that copyright laws are going to be allowed to shift. Archivists, hobbyists, and the everyday person do not have the means to go against the multi-million or multi-billion-dollar publishers that have a vested interest in preserving their finances in any way that they can. We live in a world where corporations have the capability to exert far more influence over laws than people do. I don't think it's an absolute impossibility that our copyright system could change in a way that benefits actual creators and everyday people, but I don't think we should get our hopes up. I think the real solution, for now at least, is simply piracy. Support the people who do take it upon themselves to archive games, and maybe even archive your own software. Jacob Geller has a fantastic video on preserving data. I'll put a link down to it below, that talks about how we operate on the modern internet with the idea that most data will be around forever now that it's digital. But the truth is, bits and pieces of books, blogs, forums, movies, articles, and yes, games disappear every day. The Internet Archive, which now has over 100 petabytes of data stored on their Wayback Machine, is still missing many snapshots from certain periods of time. According to the Video Game History Foundation, 87% of all historical games are at risk for being lost. I believe it's imperative that software preservation efforts continue, even at the cost of legality. I would rather archives operate in legal gray areas than pay the price of lost history. So go ahead, check out these sites, download some fun old games, take part in this video game history. And don't ever let people shit on you for refusing to follow copyright laws that benefit corporations over people. If you made it to the end of this video, then thank you. I appreciate your support. On the screen now are lists of some channels that I sourced footage from. You should definitely go check them out if you're interested, and I'll have some more detailed links down below, of course. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see some more of my stuff in the future. But until then, take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.